Let us begin with session 10 of this workshop, which is going to be handled by Dr. Ashley Stevens. And this focuses on a very important topic, valuation. We have already introduced Dr. Ashley, so let me not spend any more time and hand over the session to him.
Thank you. Now it's on. Switch it on. Better. Yeah, that works. Good. So, thank you. So, valuation, Venture Center took my slides and reformatted them. And in the process, they left off my footer. Okay? Now, my footer has a copyright notice. Being a good intellectual property person, I put a copyright notice on my slides, right? And this copyright notice says 1993 to 2025. Okay? This is most of my slides, most of my talks. The copyright notice starts around 2000, 2005. This one goes back to 1993. This is a personal journey, and I'll explain to you how. I was hired by Ohio State University to put on a one-day valuation seminar. And as I was doing that, I thought, you know, I've taught this in a lot of countries. I wonder how many. And I went back through my notes, and I found I'd given this in 26 countries. This is the talk that has taken me around the world. And you can see I've done it in India before. So, if you think about the technology transfer process that we've been talking about here, you start with your disclosure, you evaluate it, you market it, hopefully you get expressions of interest, you negotiate a deal, and you sign a deal. There's a couple of analyses you need to do along the way. Before you can market it, you have to have your licensing strategy, and before you can negotiate, you need to have a valuation idea. So I'm going to talk about valuation versus pricing, how you get value out in a license. I'll talk about risk and value. I'll talk about some methodologies, cost, rules of thumb, comparables, and DCF. So as you start off in a license negotiation, you've got to ask yourself things like, we talked about this yesterday, what is the product? Is it a new product, a new market? How disruptive is it? How is value added? Is it a new use, new product, lower cost, etc.? The business model for revenue generation, market and competition. And, you know, how much value does your IP bring to the business? Materials. Okay, since the computer's here, I'm going to face this way since it changes better. All these questions. What is the single most important factor that's going to determine the value of your IP?
What licensee wants to pay.
What the licensee wants to pay.
Scope of that.
Scope of?
Technology.
Scope of the technology.
Market demand.
Huh?
Market demand.
Market demand? Nah. The name of the licensee. Okay? The licensee company is going to determine how much you get from it by their success in developing it and marketing it. So you need to ask yourself, are they committed? Are they capable? Are they adequately resourced? So what do we mean by evaluation?
Quantification of the IP.
Quantification of the IP.
Value for licensee.
Value for licensee. Let's say you want to sell your house or your car. What's the first thing you do? You try to identify the market value. In other words, but it's your opinion on what that value is. And you may or may not find a seller who agrees with you, a buyer, who agrees with you and will pay it. So there are various valuation techniques for IP. They'll give you different answers. So for an important technology, you might use more than one. But at the end of the day, they're an opinion, aren't they? They're your opinion of what it's worth. What's pricing, on the other hand?
the cost that is quoted for the licensing.
No, I'm just saying you go to a supermarket, you pick something up off the shelf. The shelf says the price, right? By you picking it up, you've agreed to that price, haven't you? So pricing, you don't negotiate in a supermarket, obviously, but selling your house, selling your car, licensing your technology, you will negotiate. And if it's a successful negotiation, you'll have one outcome. If it's an unsuccessful negotiation, you finished up apart. You didn't come to a single conclusion. And it becomes a commitment. You decide to sell your house, somebody agrees to your price, you sign a contract with them, and you're now obligated to go through with that transaction. And if you have a basis for your valuation, when you sit down in that negotiation, you will negotiate the bases of that pricing. And that might be a tough negotiation, but it's a rational negotiation. Without a valuation basis, you negotiate from emotion, and that is an ugly negotiation. And if there is a single takeaway from this session, I want it to be have a basis for your valuation. So, let me take you back to early in my career, 1991. I get my job at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And there's an inbox on my desk with things that were underway. And I found I had a hot technology. Now, I think we discussed yesterday, didn't we, what a hot technology is? Yes, sir. What is a hot technology?
Already
Two people interested, right? Mine had to be white hot. I had 3 people interested, okay? It was a cell surface adhesion molecule, LAM1, also known as L-selectin. Cell surface adhesion molecules were really hot in the early 1990s. So the first company's coming in, and I'm going to have to make a proposal to them. I had no idea. Now, I'd spent 9 years in biotech, so I knew some pharmaceutical licensing people. So I called them up, and I said, got this hot molecule, L-selectin. Everybody seems to want it. What do I ask for it? And they say, beats me. I'd started to get to know some academic licensing people, so I called them up. L-selectin, everybody wants it. What do I ask? And they say, beats me. So the company arrives, we sit down. I'm sure in India you talk about cricket, we talk about baseball, we talk about the Red Sox, we get down to business, and they say, so this molecule of yours, L-selectin, we're very interested. What do you want for it? What could I do? I plucked a number from the air and put it on the table. And they said to me, why do you think it's worth that much? And I said, well, we think this is a very important molecule. And they said, well, yeah, so do we. That's why we're here. But why do you think it's worth that much? All I could do was say, well, we think this is a very important molecule. And they said, yes, we've agreed to that. But why do you think it's worth that much? What are you comparing it with? What's your basis? And all I could say was, well, we think this is a very important molecule. And they got up, politely thanked me for my time, flew back to California, and I never could get them back to the table. Luckily, I had the 2 backups, and I did a deal with one of those because the inventor of the technology, Tom Tedder, was very well regarded within Dana-Farber. And if I had scared away the only potential licensee, I think what turned out to be a successful career in tech transfer would have been cut off at a very, very early stage. But this got me thinking, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be some science to this. So I would go to, back then there were 2 national LES meetings a year, Licensing Executive Society, the business licensing people. And I would go to those meetings, and every workshop that had the word valuation in the title, I'd be sitting in the front row. And I found I was getting more confused, not less confused. These guys were saying, using phrases like the excess return on intellectual property. I'm thinking, okay, how do I measure the excess return on my Lam 1? And in one of these sessions, I was in the front row, and this guy's going on about the excess return. And there was a lady from Sandoz in the row behind me before the Novartis merger. And I thought, well, maybe it's just we academic institutions, we're unsophisticated, we're not trained. So I leant back and I said to her, do you use this technique? And she said, I don't even understand the words he's using. And I felt a lot better. And I slowly came to the realization that, when do you value a technology? What these people were talking about was valuing it retrospectively in litigation. Now, you only sue somebody when there's a product in the market generating lots of money to be able to afford to pay the lawyers and the experts and enough money left over to be worth fighting over. And in litigation, we have this wonderful tool in the US called discovery. And your lawyers write to their lawyers and say, we need all this information from you to make our case. And they will send it to you. And we take discovery very, very seriously. If lawyers or companies deliberately destroy evidence that could be detrimental to them, the lawyers will get disbarred. They won't be able to be lawyers anymore. We take it very, very seriously. And for this, you establish the value at a point in time. Do you remember the BlackBerry? Yeah, you remember it? They were found guilty of infringing some patents owned by a little company that had tried to develop the BlackBerry and had failed. And they were ordered to pay $1.3 billion. And they did, because otherwise the judge would have said, stop selling your BlackBerries. They paid it at a point in time. So, it's an adversarial process. The outcome is imposed judicially. That's not what we do. We are valuing technology prospectively, deal makers. And there's an asymmetry of information. The university understands the technology, and the company understands the market. And I'll show you in a moment, you shouldn't try to get paid upfront in full. You want to extract the value over time as the technology's value increases. And it has to be a win-win situation, because if you're licensing a patent, the relationship is going to last up to 20 years if the technology is successful. And I'm working on a lawsuit right now where the technology was licensed as a hybridoma. And the deal was, as long as you're selling, you pay. And they've been paying for 40 years now. So these relationships have to be fair to both sides because they're going to be long-term. Now, in fairness to me, I was doing this in 1991, and the first textbook on valuation in licensing by Richard Razgaitis didn't come out till 1999. So I think I can be forgiven for my ignorance and mistakes. But what it meant was, as I learned stuff, I would put on workshops at the autumn meeting to teach my fellow licensing people what I'd learned, and that grew and became the autumn valuation course. So what do we mean by valuation? A written analysis of what we believe the value of a technology to be. I think you've got to be prepared to give it to the other side, identify where you got the data, discuss the data, and you might have to modify your proposal based on discussions with the other side. They may say, no, you got the data wrong, here's the right data. They might say, no, this is the wrong valuation methodology, here's what you should be doing. And what do we mean by a license valuation? Constructing the various financial elements of a proposed license. All of these things that I'll talk about more in a moment. In other words, the term sheet. And what do you mean by the value of a deal? You often see in the press the value of a deal. It is the sum of all the fixed payments, the upfront fee, all the milestone payments, and you assume every developmental milestone is successfully reached, and every sales milestone is reached, and for every potential product. But you don't include earned royalties. And this is known a little unkindly, I think, as bio-bucks, because in the biotech industry, companies want to show they're doing massive deals with companies. So here's an example, Amgen with Generate Biomedicines, and it was described as a $1.9 billion deal.
So how are we getting the payment even after the expiry of the patent? For that,
Don't jump that far ahead. We'll get there. Okay, we'll get there. Okay?
because you were telling that you are still getting it after 40 years of the technology, right?
Well, there wasn't a patent.
Okay.
If it was a patent, it would have expired. But the license was for the know-how of the hybridoma.
Okay.
And the company originally proposed 25 years. And in the last stages of negotiation, the academic institution said, no, why 25 years? As long as you sell this diagnostic product using my hybridoma, then you should pay. And they agreed. And
So
that's 40 years now.
In the initial agreement itself, it was a perpetual license kind of thing.
I'm sorry?
In the initial agreement itself, it was kind of a perpetual license.
Well, the term was as long as they sell the product.
Okay.
They can stop paying royalties by stopping selling the product. Okay? So you go back, this value was $50 million up front, and they could get up to $370 million for each product, and there were 5 potential products, so that's where you get your $1.9 billion. Now I want to talk about risk. There's a lot of risk in developing a technology. There's an R&D risk, an FDA risk. Product may not be safe, may not be efficacious. There's a standards risk. If you're doing life sciences, suddenly IEEE might come up with a standard with which your technology is not compatible. There's a manufacturing risk. You may not be able to make it at an acceptable cost. There's a marketing risk. Another company with an inferior technology but many more salespeople may be able to beat you. There's a competitive risk. Somebody solving that problem with a different approach may get to market first. There's a legal risk, a patent risk. That's much less these days, but when I started in this business, US patents were confidential until they issued. And so you could be developing a technology in all good faith and not know that you were at risk. And it wasn't until relatively recently that we published patent applications in the US. I think that's much more rational. We joined the rest of the world, essentially. Overall, they tell you that 1 in 10,000 drug candidates makes it to market. Only 1 in 3,000 raw ideas make it to market. And really scary, 1/3 to 2/3 of new product launches by sophisticated consumer product companies fail to recover the investment in developing that product. Really scary. So this is a high-risk business. And there's a very fundamental relationship between value and risk. And as risk goes down, value goes up. And our technology is right back here at the highest risk point and the lowest value. And as the licensee slowly reduces the risk, the value goes up, and our job in the license agreement is to capture this increase in value. So you probably shouldn't even try to get paid up front. Our job is to extract the value over time, share in the growth in the value. So I think you have this drink Gatorade here, right? Sports drink invented by the University of Florida in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And in 1963, Robert Cade, the inventor, urologist, offered Stokely Van Camp the rights for $1 million. 1963. That was real money back in 1963. And he had a complete package. He had patent applications, trade secret formula. He had data. He had a trademark. Stokely Van Camp declined. They said the test market was going to cost them $1 million because there was nothing like this in the market. So they had to test to see whether people would buy it. And he said, you know, if I pay you another $1 million, I'm doubling my risk. So instead, I'll pay you royalties. So if I'm successful, you're successful. And to date, Stokely Van Camp, which got bought by Quaker, who wanted Gatorade, which got bought by Pepsi, which wanted Gatorade, have paid about $2 billion in royalties. Now, you ask the University of Florida how much they paid. Now, they made from Gatorade, they'll tell you much less. There was a lawsuit in the finest American tradition. There was a lawsuit between Cade and the University of Florida, and the resolution was University of Florida gets 20% of the royalties, and a trust that Cade established to share the value with the people who helped him gets 80%. So the actual number is $2 billion. So you can see they could have got it for $1 million in 1963. Instead, they paid $2 billion. And I got to say, I think that was a good business decision back in 1963. So where is the value extracted in a license? Well, you get an upfront fee. You get ongoing pre-commercial payments, patent costs, milestone payments, annual minimum royalties. There might be some research collaboration and support. Sub-license income sharing, earned royalties. So let's talk about these. Come on, here we go. So if you look at it, there are three basic types of payment. Fixed lump sum payments. We may need a new battery. Can somebody kind of get me a new battery? And I've got batteries in my bag. Okay. So fixed lump sum payments are single payments you get as long as the license is in effect. So things like the upfront fee, the annual maintenance fee, annual minimum royalties. And then there are contingent lump sum payments, okay? Payments you get, single payments you get if certain things happen. These are things like you might have agreed a patent milestone. It's very important to you that there be an issued patent. So the patent issues, you pay me some money. Developmental milestones are very common. Sales milestones. If you've got stock in the company and it goes public, you may be able to sell that. And you may get payments from when the company does sub-licenses. And then, so here you're sharing in the increase in value of the technology as it gets developed. And then you get running royalties, which payments that depend on how much use of your technology the licensee makes. So some of these payments you'll see are made pre-commercialization and some after. So these are probably made pre-commercialization, sales milestones, running royalties. Those are made after the product gets into the marketplace. So the upfront fee, usually a cash fee. We always, the first thing academic license negotiations put on the table is pay me back my sunk patent costs. And this reflects the initial value of the technology being transferred. As I said, you've got to face up the fact that academic technologies have a low value as they leave the university's laboratory. And a new company will have very little money, and you probably shouldn't take anything, perhaps just the patent costs, but don't try and get a cash fee from a young company because you want the money they have been able to raise to go into developing the technology. So what they do have a lot of is stock, so take stock in the negotiation with the startup company. The ongoing pre-commercial payments, things like the patent costs, milestone payments. These reflect the increase in the value of the technology to the licensee as they make progress. So they say, I invest, and if I'm successful, I have to pay you? Yeah, That's the quid pro quo for me not having asked for very much upfront. These are common with life science inventions. Why do you think that is?
Regulatory framework and long gestation period.
I'm sorry? Louder.
Long gestation period and regulatory approval.
So it's the regulatory approval, okay? Everywhere around the world, a drug goes through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you apply for approval, you get approval, right? What you don't want is to have arguments with your licensees, particularly during the development process. And if you said, you'll pay me this amount of money when you start phase 1, well, everybody will know whether they've started phase 1 or not. There won't be an argument, okay? That's why it works so well with life science inventions. So clinical development milestones, patent milestones, sales milestones. Annual minimum royalties, this is kind of an annual payment they make as long as they have the license. Kind of acts as a due diligence mechanism, particularly if you've licensed non-exclusively. If they've lost interest in the technology, they're not going to want to make a payment for something they're not using, so they'll terminate and give it back to you. You typically escalate these substantially after 3 or so years, because if they keep going, it means the technology is worth more to them. And these are more common with physical science inventions. Why do you think that is? Let's say you're developing a software or you're developing a new chemical process. There aren't universal standards the way there are with phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. If you're developing a software, a key developmental milestone is beta testing. Well, what's a beta test? How many people? How many users? Because they'll do various user tests at different scales. So you don't want to have an argument. If you're developing a chemical process, obviously a key developmental stage will be a pilot plant. Well, what's a pilot plant? A kilogram, 50 kilograms, 1% of full scale, 5% of full scale? You don't want an argument. So with physical science inventions, then you typically escalate them so that if the company is still developing the technology and still making the payments, it must mean it's working, so the value's gone up. Sublicense income sharing is really, really important. And if you're licensing to a startup or a small company, this may be where the real value is created when they do a deal with a big company. And the challenge is that you have to negotiate what's going to happen years before the sublicense happens. You're going to have to negotiate these terms up front when you negotiate the license, and you don't know what's going to happen. Bingo. Okay, good. So the parties don't know how the sublicense will be structured. And the university, your objective is going to be to ensure that the licensee can't game the system by structuring the sublicense to minimize what it pays to the university. And the solution is you get a piece of every payment they get from the sublicense. Lou Berneman, former president of Autumn, said, "You will pay me every which way there is." Now, you exclude items, some items for which there's a deliverable, things like if they're going to pay you research support, they won't pay a piece of that to the university. If they purchase equity in the licensee, which typically often happens, you won't get a piece of that. There are kind of 3 models that have been evolved. First is what we call a pass-through. The university gets the same running royalty rate on the sublicensee's sales as if the licensee sold the product, plus a percentage of every other payment other than running royalties. Okay? The way this gets implemented in a license agreement is the definition of net sales will say sales by licensee, licensee's affiliates, and any sub-licensee. Then you know you've got a pass-through. Second one's an allocation, in which the university gets a set percentage of every payment the licensee gets from the sub-licensee. The licensee may say to you, look, I'll pay you 4% of my sales, but what if I work on this for 5 years and I can only get an 8% royalty from my sub-licensee? I got to give you half. I only get half to pay me for all that 5 years of work. So let's agree I'll give you a percentage of what I get. And then you have a tiered allocation in which the university gets a lower percent of the payments received from the sub-licensee before commercialization. And what that does is it lets the licensee use those payments to develop the technology and avoid raising capital. So if you own stock in them, you'll get diluted less. And university gets a higher percentage of running royalties after commercialization. And the percentages may be based on when the licensee does the sub-license, because the longer they develop it themselves before doing the sub-license, the more the value they're transferring is from their work, and the smaller percentage is from the university. So, year 1, 25%, year 2, 20%, year 3, and on 15% might be an approach. Or it might be the stage of clinical development, because the later the stage of clinical development, the more work the licensees put in. Here's an example, mRNA vaccines, also known as the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech technology. Key enabling technology is the 2005 Weissman-Carico uridine, pseudouridine substitution technology. Penn filed patents in 2006. Carico and Weissman founded RNARX in 2007. They were never successful. They never got beyond SBIR grants. They shut down in 2013, never got as far as getting a license to the Penn patents. Penn licensed a research reagent company in Wisconsin called CellScript, who set up a subsidiary called mRNA Ribotherapeutics. They got $300,000 up front and some share of sub-license income. And it was mRNA Ribotherapeutics that sub-licensed Moderna and BioNTech. The license terms, you can get them from Moderna's 10Ks, and BioNTech, being a foreign company, their 20F reports to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Moderna paid $75 million up front, $26 million in milestone payments, 3.5% running royalty rate. BioNTech reported, they didn't report the upfront, $26 million in milestones, the same, and low to mid-single digit royalties. Well, mid-single digit is 5%, so 3.5% certainly is in low to mid-single digits, right? Moderna paid $641 million in 2021, and Pfizer sales were about double Moderna's, total royalties $2 billion. And Penn's reported royalty income was $30.5 million in 2020, $310 million in 2021, and $1.25 billion in 2022. And Carico and Weissman get 30% between them. I think their retirement income funds are secure. And of course, they got the Nobel Prize. Not a bad year's work, right? Not a bad year's work. Let's look at running royalties, also known as earned royalties. And these are the main post-commercialization economic component of the license, where you're going to get the biggest amount of money if the product's successful. And it's an equation. The royalty payments are the royalty base multiplied by the royalty rate, and they're made for the duration of the royalty term. And you can see I've capitalizing this to show that they are defined terms in the license. The royalty base measures the extent of the licensee's return from using the technology. You could use number of units sold. You could use sales. You could use profits. If you're going to do profits, define very, very carefully. Is it gross profits? Is it net profits? Profits after taxes? Or what? I don't think an academic institution should ever use profits to define its royalty terms. Big companies might, when they're doing a major collaboration and they want to share the profits, but I don't think that's appropriate. for university licenses, and I think I've only ever come across one academic license in the generic drug space that was written in terms of a profit share. Big reason is they're very difficult and expensive to audit. If the technology is successful, you're making a lot of money, you should audit the licensee. And in an audit, you will send an accountant in to verify the numbers that the licensee reported to you, and the more numbers that auditor has to report, the more they'll charge you. So I would say the most common royalty base today is net sales, and those are gross sales less either standard deductions, things like shipping, insurance, returns, things like that. That's the most common. Or sometimes you see a standard deduction like 2 or 3% to allow for all of those. Royalty rate, how much of the licensee's return you get from using the technology. And the royalty rate might either be flat, where you get the single royalty rate for all sales, or it might be tiered, when you get a royalty rate that's different at different levels of sales. Do you think the royalty rate should go up or down as the product sales go up?
Could be both ways. Could be both ways.
Could be both ways. Well, in any one license agreement, it's only go one way. So do you think it should go up or do you think it should go down? Up, okay. Hands up if you think up. Okay. Why do you think up?
Like when it goes up, the profit will also be going up and the technology is more successful.
Okay. Who thinks it should go down? Okay. And who isn't prepared to put their hand up? No. Why do you think it should go down?
As the sales goes up and the company, the licensee puts more effort into the market, and he should be rewarded for that effort because he's taking the product ahead. He's ensuring that the technology is deployed in the right manner.
Okay. So, basic marketing theory says the bigger selling products are more profitable, right? You've got a bigger volume of sales to spread your fixed cost over. Basic royalty theory, we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, is the 25% rule, says the royalty should reflect the profitability of the product. Therefore, if the product's more profitable, the royalty rate should go up. So you were spot on right in your answer. And that's I'm impressed. Most people say, oh no, it should go down because we're going to get more and more money because the sales are going up. No. And in the Gatorade license, I was able to find that online. I'll show you how in a moment. And that royalty rate went down. But then I wasn't teaching this course back then, so he didn't have the benefit of my wisdom. Okay. Royalty term is how long you get paid. Universities usually use the last to expire patent on a country-by-country basis, right? Companies generally use, and this is particularly in the drug space, the longer of the last to expire patent and the expiration of regulatory exclusivity. In the US, if a FDA approves a drug, they can't approve another identical molecule for that indication for 5 years. And if you've got a biological drug, it's for 12 years. So regulatory exclusivity, particularly for biological drugs, can go way beyond the patent life. Okay? And then the final one is 10 years from first commercial sale, or even more. Negotiate. I've seen 12, 15. I've even seen one academic license that got 20 years from first commercial sale. Okay? And I just think universities should use that formulation much more. I've seen licenses where a new use was discovered for the drug and got approval years later. It got delayed, and the royalty term provision was badly written, and the university didn't get the years from first commercial sale. You do need a royalty step down after patents expire. In the US, it is a de facto antitrust violation to charge the same royalty rate for a technology after the patents have expired. That goes back to a Supreme Court decision in 1964 that was reaffirmed in a new Supreme Court decision in 2015. Traditionally, the step down was 50%, so a patent protected rate of 5% after the patents expire for the ongoing use of the know-how, 2.5%, but 10 to 25% meets the test. I won't go on that. I'm sorry, I thought I took these out. It's more detailed than we've got time for today. A problematic issue is combination products, where you have the product that's sold contains several components that could be separate products, and your technology is only in one of the components. And these separate parts may or may not be sold separately. Let's take an example. You have a vaccine for math disease and spelling disease that is sold together for $1,000. Now, the vaccine for math disease is sold for $900 by itself, and it costs $50 to manufacture. And the vaccine for spelling disease is sold for $300 alone, and the cost of goods was $100. The royalty rate for the math disease vaccine is 10%. And that's what your technology is. You have the technology for math disease. Spelling disease is not covered by your patents, not royalty bearing. So what's the royalty do? Do you want me to put the numbers back up again? $900 cost $50, $300 cost $100. Royalty rate for your math disease is 10%. What's the royalty do? Is it 90, 75, 50, 33? 90. Okay, so we have 90. Any other thoughts? We've got 3 other choices. So the normal solution is to prorate over the combined sales price. So math and spelling together are $1,200. So math is 75% of the combined total, right? 900 of the 1,200. So the royalty would be 3/4 of the 1,000 times 10%, which is $75, okay? The problem arises if one component isn't sold separately. How do you prorate? Historically, licensees often defaulted to prorating over the cost of goods. And I think that's a terrible way. In our example, the total cost of goods sold was $150, and math is 1/3 of the total, so the royalty rate would only be 33% of 1,000 times 10%, right? So versus the 3/4 that we got. I was unable to find an economically rational approach. I was hired by a pharmaceutical company which had a combination product on which they owned royalties on one component. And they said, find out what we should do. And I called in every chit I could. I talked to corporate attorneys. I talked to patent attorneys. I talked to investment bankers. I talked to business development people. I couldn't find a rational approach. Do not put in your license agreement, something shall be determined in good faith. There is no good faith when money is on the table. Okay, if you ever get to that clause, you'll finish up in arbitration. It shall be determined in good faith is a guaranteed arbitration case. You don't want it. And I hate to say it, but you may just need to allocate equal value to each component. I mean, I thought in my drug case, perhaps the company had not human clinical data, but perhaps animal data on how much of the impact on the disease was due to their component versus the other. They didn't. They just didn't develop it that way. I couldn't find any data that could let you make a rational decision. So maybe you just have to divide by 2. So let's look at a hypothetical license. Okay, $50,000 issue fee, annual minimum royalties starting at $10,000 in years 2 to 4, $25,000 in years 5 to 7, $50,000 a year thereafter. Milestone payments that kind of align with regulatory approvals, regulatory steps, 50, 100, 250, 500. A royalty rate of 5%, sunk patent costs of $75,000, ongoing annual patent costs of $10,000 to $25,000.
What is sunk patent cost? Sunk patent cost.
How much you've spent on patents before you do the license. Okay? And one of the first things universities want is to get their sunk patent costs back. In the US, you can look at the data and you see we are able to recover about half our patent expenditures from licensees. Now, US universities spend a lot on patents, but they get about half of it back from licensees. And let's say the sales profile of the product, sales start in year 7 at $750,000. They peak at $25 million in years 13, 14, and 15, and then start to decline. Perhaps the product is getting obsolete or something. Here is what the flow of money would look like in that license. So the blue are lump sum payments, the green is patent reimbursements, and the red is running royalties. Now, several things leap out of this, don't they? Perhaps the biggest is that the vast bulk of the money is in the running royalties. The next one is that the lump sum payments are much smaller than the running royalties until we get to the last 1 or 2. Okay? The overall takeaway from this chart is negotiate hard, predicated on success, on the late stage milestone payments, and above all else, on the running royalty rate. Okay? I nearly blew the biggest physical sciences deal I did. It was for the technology that enables the screen of all these devices, okay? A buffer layer patent of Ted Moustakis. And we were doing an option to give them 6 months to evaluate the technology and then a license. And I tried to get too much for the option fee, and the CEO said, sorry, no, and hung up the phone. And I had to eat humble pie and go back to him a day later and say, look, I'm sorry, you were right. The value here is if you move forward, I will accept your proposal. And we got the deal done, and it was our most profitable physical sciences license ever. So how do you allocate value to inventors and patents? How do you allocate value to inventors? I think your default, yeah.
Sorry, can you go back to the graph? And what it shows the year 12 onwards. Sorry, what it shows the year 12 onwards.
Sorry, the year which?
Year 12 onwards, 13 onwards,
Yep.
the royalty going down. What exactly it indicates? And
Well, because the sales went down. So you're getting 5% of 25 million there. You're only getting 5% of 15 million at the end, okay?
oh, so it's not percentage. So
No, that's the actual
Actual.
dollars, okay?
Okay.
See? Like, this is $1.2 million a year, okay? How do you allocate value to inventors? I think your default position should be equal shares, unless they all sign an agreement to unequal shares. This tends to protect the junior inventors, the graduate students, okay? You can include non-inventors if all the inventors agree. So perhaps somebody who did a lot of the work but didn't actually make an inventive contribution. How do you allocate value to patents if you're licensing a bundle? It may require some judgment. Let's say you're licensing a drug and the composition of matter patent is most valuable and the method of treating, formulation, manufacturing are less valuable. So it can be very tricky. Oops, I'm sorry, I thought I had an example. I did in the short version I did downstairs, but I don't have an example here, I'm sorry. How do you allocate value to institutions? Let's say you invented the technology in a partnership between your scientist and a scientist somewhere else. Very common situation. Can be tricky. You can do it per patent in the technology bundle. Quantitative approaches, you might look at the research expenditures on developing the technology at each institution. You might look at the number of inventors. Remember, always have a defendable basis for your proposals. Oh, I did have the example. Here we go, drug. Let's say the composition of matter came 100% from institution 1. The method of treating was 50-50 between them, and the formulation came from institution 2. Well, perhaps you propose the composition of matter is the most invaluable. We give it a factor of 3. The method of treating is less valuable. We'll give it a value of 1. And the formulation, we'll give it a half. Well, here the weighted contribution is 3 times 100, 50 times 1, half times 1, and formulation, nothing for institution 1, half for institution 2, adds up to 350 and 100, so 78%, 22%. And so you make that, your institution 1, you make that proposal to institution 2, and perhaps they come back and say, no, come on, the formulation is worth at least as much as the method of treating because it covers all applications, okay? So you perhaps agree and you modify it and put it in and rechange, okay? As I said, always have a basis for your proposal. So let's look at specific approaches to valuation. Economists will tell you there's only 3 ways you value an asset: cost, market, income. Licensing, we have a number of approaches: cost, rules of thumb, comparables, ranking, rating, discounted cash flow, Monte Carlo, auction, common sense, equity. Today we're going to talk about these 4. So look back, what did it cost me to develop the technology? And I'm going to value it by saying I want my costs back and I want to make a profit on those costs. Okay? It's a rational approach. Trouble is the cost to develop relevant? Think about, now you're selling your house. I bought my house in 1983, and you can look it up in Zillow, and you can find that I paid $155,000 for it in 1983. You might be able to find the costs that we've put in to expand it and make it nicer. But would any of that be relevant if I wanted to sell that house in 2025? No, wouldn't be relevant, would it? I would value my house in 2025 by how much people had spent, paid for houses like mine in the town I live in, right? So is cost to develop relevant? As a silly example, would you want to or be able to sell a used lottery ticket for what you paid for it? Obviously not. If it's a losing ticket, it's worth scrap paper, and if it's a winning ticket, you obviously want much more for it. And licensees, companies might say, but it didn't cost you anything. You got a grant to do this. And your response is, yeah. And the grantee gave me the ownership of the technology and wanted me to get a return on it because they only paid me my costs, no profit. and the return on the intellectual property is where I make my profit. I think two areas where cost enters in academic license negotiations, obviously, sunk patent costs. How much have we spent? I've got the evidence. Here's my invoices. Pay it back. And then, as I said, you could use it to determine the relative ownership in a collaboration. As an example of how it's a pretty blunt instrument, let's imagine a situation where you've spent $50,000 to develop a technology and you want to double your money. So you want $100,000 for it. And one company looks at this and says, well, I could develop it, an alternative myself, and that would cost me $40,000. And I'd need to license in a lot of intellectual property to do that, and that's another $40,000. And it would take me 3 years to do it, so the value of being out the market is another $40,000. So it's worth $120,000 to me. You only want $100,000? Great deal. You know, sign me up. On the other hand, somebody might say, well, I could do it myself for $20,000. I'd license something in for another $20,000, and I could get it done in a year, so that's worth it. Another $20,000. So you want $100,000? It's only worth $60,000 to me. No deal. So you can see it's not a great method, but it is for early stage technology. Before you know the value down the road, it's certainly something that you have data on, and it's something that you can justify. You might take your cost and say, okay, I want those costs back over the upfront fee and the milestone payments, and then if it gets into the marketplace, then the running royalties will be my profit. That would be a way that you might use that information in a license. Some examples of cost-based valuations. The way we do sponsored research agreements with companies in the US is we can't specify the royalty rates in the license agreement for complex not-for-profit taxation reasons. And companies tend to be uncomfortable when you say, if you want to exercise the option we give you, we negotiate in good faith. Good faith. The research works. I want it. You hold a gun to my head. I think we've tended to got over that now, but that was what you saw a lot 20, 30 years ago. So the University of Minnesota and Penn State has sponsored research models where the sponsor can get a fully paid up license for an extra 10% of the research costs. So 10% of the fully loaded costs, including the indirect cost. And disease foundations. We have foundations in the US that support development of drugs to treat the disease that their foundation's interested in. And they often demand royalties in return for their funding. And those royalties are typically capped at 2 to 3 times the amount that the foundation has invested in developing the technology. So, rules of thumb, the 25% rule. Called the Goldscheider principle, after Robert Goldscheider, who first formulated it. And he stated the licensor should receive 25% and the licensee should receive 75% of the pre-tax profits from a licensed product. It was based on his empirical observations, just like Moore's law was based on Gordon Moore's observations of the early days of the evolution of the integrated circuit, right? He was licensing technologies for the top American TV company starting in 1959. They didn't want their innovations licensed to other American TV companies. They wanted them, to distinguish their products, but they were happy to see them used in other countries. And Goldscheider negotiated the licenses. He had a complete IP portfolio, patents, ongoing development, trademarks, et cetera, and the licensees were making a 20% pre-tax profit and paying a 5% royalty, and they were either number 1 or number 2 in their markets, despite strong competition. And The licenses were only for 3 years at a crack. So you could see that a company might say, well, that's kind of high, but I want to keep rights to the technology, so I'll pay it for 3 years, but then we'll negotiate down when we get to the first new negotiation. But they didn't. They happily renewed their licenses. And so he concluded that this economic relationship resulted in a successful, long-term, win-win relationship. It's applicable to fully enabling technology. You may need to prorate it if other IP is also needed. Note it's applied to fully loaded pre-tax profits, not the gross margin. You want to express it as a percent of net sales in your license. Remember I said never express your royalty rate as a percent of profits. So your royalty rate would be 25% of the expected pre-tax profit margin. So an example for a patent that fully enables the product, let's say you sell it for $200, costs $100 to manufacture, $50 sales, research, and administration overheads. So you've got a $50 pre-tax profit. The patent owner's share of that pre-tax profit should be 25% of the 50, or $12.5. And the royalty rate would be 12.5 divided by the sales price, or 6.25%. Okay? Clear how you use it? If the patent only 75% enables the product, then 4.69 and so on. Obviously, I wouldn't quote percentages like that, but I'd round them off. I found it a good starting point for negotiation, but it's almost never the final rate agreed to. If you adjust it according to enable value, typically after analysis of manufacturing cost and all these things, round off the numbers, I'd say 4.5, not 4.69 and so on. I found it of limited value in academic licensing because the early stage, we don't have the data on what it's going to cost to make and stuff like that. I found it very helpful if I had to go into a new industry that I'm not familiar with, and I can look at the profitability of leading companies in that industry, and that can guide me on what I can look for my technologies. Actually, I'm going to skip over that. And there are other examples of risk transfer revenue sharing. It shows up in different sectors, and it seems to be frequently perceived as fair when the future risk is transferred from one party to another. Look at our own royalty sharing policies. The inventors completed their part, institutions taking on the financial risk of patenting and marketing, and common income sharing arrangements are a third, a third, a third, or a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, a quarter. Sub-license income sharing. Often the licensor's investment's complete, the licensee is taking the technology forward. 25% is a good starting point for negotiating sub-license income sharing. Oil and gas royalties. Landowner has made its investment in buying the land. It's going to make no contribution to extracting the resources. The oil gas company takes on the financial risk of drilling, and the royalty rates are on federal land in the US 12.5%, and so on. So you can see we're in this kind of around 20-25% appears to be here. GM seed development in the 1990s. Seed company's investment is over. Farmer takes on the financial risk of raising the crop. And the impact of biotech was companies priced GM varieties to keep 25% of the increased value. Okay, that's not much interest in India since you don't allow GM crops apart from cotton, but there you go. Okay, go on. Okay. And we'll return to looking at this in the MVP split analyses later. So now let's say look around. Industry standards or comparables. We said that if I was wanting to value my house, I would look at comparable houses, and I do that through a database called Zillow, or you can go to the local registry of deeds and look up comparable transactions in your neighborhood. I think it's the most important valuation method for academic licensing. So I've got Zillow for my house. Where do I go to value intellectual property? Well, you can have an internal database. There are surveys. There are public announcements. There's word of mouth. There's litigation. And then there's required disclosure. So internal database, let's say you're at a well-established university, government laboratory that's been licensing technology for a long time, then you can look at licenses previously done by your organization in that sector. Look at trends over time. You know, you licensed an antibody for research purposes 5 years ago for 7%, 4 years ago for 8%, 3 years ago for 9%. Doesn't sound like you've got to the market peak yet. So, you know, keep trying upwards until you hit resistance. Published surveys, there aren't many. Most are really old. There are 3 good current surveys from LES. And I think every licensing office should have one person who's a member of LES to access all this stuff and to access the LES directory of licensing people at different companies. So they do a biopharmaceutical survey every 2 years. The 2023 one will be coming out soon. They've done a number of high-tech surveys, and they've done one chemicals, energy, and materials survey. So the 2021s, they got 116 complete responses from members. These were the most common areas. 84% of the deals were exclusive. 59% included the US, 54% were global. 61% were pre-IND, so it hadn't gone into humans yet. That's really helpful for universities since by and large our stuff hasn't gone into humans yet. 50 had expected peak sales over $500 million. The royalty structures, 53 had fixed royalties, 54 had tiered royalties, 9 had no royalty, of which 2%, so 2 of them I think, had a profit sharing mechanism. And here's the flat royalties. They look at 4 different groups. Here is the distinction. This is phase 2A, so when you've got efficacy data. So you can see, once you've got efficacy data, risk has been drastically reduced and the royalty rate goes up correspondingly to reflect that reduction in risk. And here's how the tiered royalties worked out. This is for the highest value of the proof of concept. You can see they start at the same rate as where they were flat, and they go up substantially from that. And tiered are generally higher than flat royalty rates. Autumn has its own Transact database, launched in 2015. It has academic deals. It's display or pay. You can contribute some of your deals, and if so, you can get free access, or you can pay for access. I think it's got some limitations. You have to pick the subject matter from a pick list, and all healthcare is the same code. And if you do a search for small molecule drugs, you get 80 hits, which 26 have royalty rates. And you can't download all the data into a spreadsheet for analysis, one by one. I think the Autumn database is most helpful for outside of healthcare. Required disclosure is the most important. And this is, I'm afraid, unique to the US. I've never come across another jurisdiction which has the same constraints on companies. So it's contained in filings to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So this means the company is either publicly traded or has filed to go public, and perhaps the investment bankers, the climate changed and they couldn't go public, but they can't withdraw the documents. And the agreements are contained in exhibits to either the prospectus for the initial public offering, their annual reports, their quarterly reports, or their material events. And you only have to report material transactions, and that's defined as something that impacts 10% of the company's sales or 5% of its assets. What that means is in a deal between a big company and a little company, the deal will be material to the little company. It won't be material to the big company, probably. And you can redact commercially sensitive information from public disclosure. And since we started going to electronic filing, that has certainly increased. But the redaction is only good for 5 years. And some of the databases are really good at going back at the end of the 5 years and saying to the SEC, okay, now give me the good stuff. So you have to identify comparable transactions that would be helpful, determine if the agreement has been filed with the SEC, and then find it. How do you get SEC agreements yourself? It has its own database called EDGAR. I think that stands for Electronic Data Collection and Retrieval. Imaginative. That's it, where it is. It's very user-friendly now. The early ones came up in hard-coded in HTML. They were tough to look at, but now they're WYSIWYG. Companies were phased in progressively. The largest companies had to report electronically in January 1994, and the smallest in May 1996. So it means we got about 30 years of data, which is good enough. And there are databases that collect this information and make it easily available. In technology, these are 3 of them. I think I verified them. I think they're all still in business. In life sciences, these keep changing, and these 3 are around. They either charge per agreement or an annual subscription. Those subscriptions are high. I really can't recommend them to most academic licensing officers. I don't even get one myself unless I have a client who's prepared to pay me to do it. And I don't have one currently, but I'm about to.
Here. Can we break for lunch in next 5-10 minutes if you're good to break? Or
Yeah.
you can tell us.
5 to 10 minutes. Okay, let's see where we get to.
Yeah.
Okay? And some of them let you identify agreements before you have to pay. So you could then find them yourselves through the SEC. So you can have a no-cost strategy. This is how you do it. Unfortunately, the physical science one's gone out of business. Then you find agreements using the SEC. High cost, get your own subscription. I can't recommend it. Or alternative, use a consultant for a specific technology. I do this for companies, for institutions when I have a subscription. And I'll show you another way in a moment. So let's take an example. Small interfering RNA. Tools, we're going to use Clarivate and EDGAR. This is what the Clarivate front page looks like. You can put in siRNA. I'm sorry, this doesn't come up very clearly. That's the subject. You put siRNA in, and you collect. And we got, what was it, 100 deals, and they come out. And you can, 545. And then you can press this button, click this button, and download into an Excel spreadsheet, which looks like this. You have all sorts of terms across the top here. Here's the company type. Is it a pharma? Is it a non-industrial? And so on. And academic is one. So those are the sorts of transactions we're going to look for as models. There are 38 fields covering the partners, the technology, the legal components of the deal, financial terms, and actual documents, and the stage of development. So the 548 deals, 109 had some financial information, 25 had royalty information, 164 were public sector research institutions, so universities, hospitals, government laboratories. And of those, 122 were academic, so 42 were government, so 13 government agencies, 29 non-profits. 41 had some financial information, 6 had royalty information from 1 to 10%, and 6 had the license agreement, 4 of which were unredacted. 2 were redacted. So these were the unredacted ones. These are the academic institutions. The ones I looked at were the University of Illinois with Acuity, a deal worth $2.5 million in total, $30,000 up front, $2.45 million in milestone payments, and a 3% running royalty. This is a long way of saying that I've stopped using this Clarivate database, and I now use Bioscience Advisors, which was created by Mark Edwards, the man who built this original database. You get pictures of the deal, and then you can get, they do an analysis in which they pull out specific parts of the text and put it into a database, and then you can see the actual agreement itself. And you go down, and here are the royalty provisions. These are the milestone payments, the upfront, etc. I'm sorry, these are tough to read. So what did I do here? This is, there was equity involved, and how do you find out what the equity is worth? So you can go to the Edgar company filings, and put in, what was the company's name? And up comes this 8K, and this is the key agreement where they filed this thing, and you can go there, and here's the list of attachments, and all of these are their license agreements. This is Penn, this is Illinois, and so on. And you can look them up, and here's the license agreement, and here's the royalty provisions just sitting there. If you want to value the company, you use the most recent 10Q to get the number of shares of the company outstanding. And then for the share prices, I use the NASDAQ. So here's the 10Q, and they had, what was it? It's on the next slide. Here's the share price. OPCO was $2.37 on that day. So you can get, the chart comes up showing a 1-year history. You can get up to 10 years. And here's what the company's share price looks like. You can see it's gone from down here all the way up here. This is a logarithmic scale. Back down again. So this is a pretty volatile stock. I'm not sure I would want this in my retirement portfolio. But if they had 615 million shares outstanding at $2.37, that meant the company was worth $1.5 billion that day. The University of Illinois got 3% originally. If it still owned 3%, that would be worth 43 million. I suspect there have been a lot of dilution by then. Okay, and a newer way to use SEC filings. Companies seem to be making much more detailed disclosures of deal terms in their 10Ks these days. And they're much easier to find and search than attached agreements. So as an example, I was asked by an Asian university developing a cellular therapy to come up with proposed licensing terms. And the model I used was chimeric antigen receptor T cells. And the leading US company in those was called Juno Therapeutics. Okay? They got bought by Gilead ultimately. And in their 10K, I found 5 academic stage deal terms. Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, upfront $250,000, maintenance fees, milestone payments for 2 specific products of $6.75 per licensed product, low single-digit royalties, probably means about 3 to 4%, and a proportion of payments from sub-licensees. There was Sloan Kettering, upfront of $6.9 million. These are pretty damn high upfront rates for academic technology. Annual minimums of $100,000, mid to high single-digit royalties on annual net sales of products or the performance of licensed service by us and our affiliates and sub-licensees. So this is a pass-through agreement. So mid to high single-digit, 5 to 9%. And then 6.75 million in milestone payments. Here's Seattle Children's Research Institute. Okay, so there we are. Look at that. Questions? Lunch first, questions after lunch? What do you want to do?
We can have a couple of questions if you have.
Yeah, in India, all these agreements are considered as confidential information. So, is there any mechanism we can get, some database or something in India also, in Indian context, and how all this confidential information is shared in all these databases in US? So that is the question.
So I think, as I said, only the US we do this. So you would be looking for deals that have been done outside the US. These companies are going to have to reveal them. Okay? You can look at the surveys. About half of those agreements came from members of LES, USA and Canada. About half came from other LES societies around the world.
Yeah. Just as one technical query, you wrote at one of the slides about auction. Do we really use that technique?
It has been done. There was a company called Intellectual Ventures that used to buy a lot of academic technologies. There was a time when people auctioned technologies. More in the physical sciences space, I would say. And this would be like an individual inventor or a small company that really couldn't afford to go up against a big company. And so they would put it up for auction. And there are companies that are existing just to acquire other people's patents and then enforce them.
Most of the details that you've showed, most of the details will be available for the publicly listed companies. What about the small and medium category companies? Like these informations are publicly available?
So not for private companies, but when a company wants to go public, well, it was a little company at some point. And so the deals they did when they were a little company become available if they're successful and go public.
So I have one question, we are PSRI.
I'm sorry?
We are PSRI, public sector.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So we have a policy that we don't allow sub-licensing.
Why on earth not? Do you license exclusively?
We license exclusively and non-exclusively also.
So typically you don't allow sub-licensing if you license non-exclusively, because if somebody else wants the technology, you want them to come back to you and get it from you, so you get the upfront fee. Okay? But with an exclusive license, you've got to let them sub-license, because, if they they get a point where they say, we can't effectively take this forward. We think we need to do a partnership with a big company. You've got to let them do that. When I got to Dana-Farber, they had in their license agreements that you need our permission to sub-license. And I said to them, well, why do you want permission? Well, what if we don't like their choice of sub-licensee? Well, you trusted them with the technology. You said they were the right people to develop it. If they now say, we think it's right for this company to take it forward from where we are, you've got to support that judgment. The dynamic is that the licensee has spent probably a year getting to where the big company is ready to shake hands. And they say, oh, sorry, can't shake hands just yet. We've got to go check with so-and-so university for their permission. Don't do that. In the Philippines, we found they were so concerned about corruption that for a university to do, I think it was a public university, for them to do a license deal with a company, they had to submit the finished license agreement to some government agency, some ministry. And the ministry would take a year to approve the deal. Half the time the licensee company had lost interest by then. So don't make it difficult for your licensee companies if they say, look, it's time for a big company now.
Like for government organization, how risk associated if we license and that license is sub-licensing. So risk is associated to maintain the quality of the product. Yeah, maybe there are risks that piracy will be there. So we don't have that kind of control. What is the mechanism to restrict all these things?
Well, you can always audit the licensee. They've got to be making progress reports to you until the technology gets into the marketplace, and then they make sales reports.
It's difficult to track in India. That is the reason.
Yeah, because
Hand over the technology, it's very difficult to monitor the development of the technology further.
Yeah, and I know in the life sciences space, there aren't a lot of Indian companies that you can license to. But you need rights of inspection, audit, progress reports.
Okay, let's allow just one last question because we have a section again at 4 o'clock for quick Q&A.
After giving an exclusive license, what are the different scenarios in which we have pulled it back?
So, a very important part of the negotiations is due diligence milestones. The company has to commit to getting to certain points in time, certain steps at certain points in time, or spending certain amounts, okay? And you have to be able to audit where they are. And if they fail to get there, then that is a material breach, and you can terminate the license and get the technology back. My attitude with startup companies in particular was, okay, we've agreed in the negotiation that these are the due diligence milestones, the steps you need to get to by certain points in time, some of which may be associated with payments. That's based on our best thinking at this point. If when you get started, you find problems with the technology, or you find that what we thought was the best initial application isn't, and you can't meet these due diligence milestones, then come back to us and we'll renegotiate them based on your new knowledge. And that will be a friendly negotiation. But we expect you to get it right then. And if you subsequently come back and say, no, we can't meet these due diligence milestones that we renegotiated, then that will not be a friendly negotiation. And you can have that understanding when you're talking to a young spin-out company and the founders. I once had a lawyer who tried to capture that in the agreement, and that was a disaster. But you can have that personal agreement with people.
What percentage of the normal deals will go for a renegotiation? Is there any rough numbers?
I'm sorry?
What percentage of the normal deals might go for a pullback or a renegotiation?
No idea. You probably look at it in some of these databases looking for amendments, but I mean, often an amendment is a renegotiation. And in some of my work in legal cases, I've seen agreements that have got 4, 5, 6 amendments.
Okay, so I think we should close here for this session, and remember we have a Q&A session in the 4 o'clock slot.